record this. Okay, let's record. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. ثم الصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد ولعنة الله على أعدائهم ومنكر فضائلهم من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to welcome you all to our second session on Al-Qawa'id al-Fiqhiyya, which is based on the two-volume work of Ayatollah Sheikh Baqir al-Irawani. As we mentioned last week, there is a translation of this book, and it's more of a summary because some of the sections of the book have not been translated, as I recently discovered. So it's a recommended text. You guys are encouraged to get it. I believe you might maybe find it online. But if you don't have the textbook, you'll be fine because as you can see, the notes that I provide are pretty thorough, inshallah. So last week we gave an introduction to the science of jurisprudential maxims. Now, and we spoke about the definition of al-Qa'id al-Fiqhiyya, and we spoke about some of the differences and some of the similarities between a jurisprudential maxim and a jurisprudential principle. Does anyone remember, if you can just share with me one difference between a qa'ida fiqhiyya and a qa'ida usuliyya? Like what's one difference between jurisprudential maxim and a jurisprudential principle? So if anyone wants to kind of chime in, and then inshallah we'll begin the lesson, just so we can kind of refresh what we covered last week. Any guesses? There's no penalty if you get it wrong, so it's...
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. Inshallah, you're doing well.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Yes, sister.
So, one of them, I don't remember which one. Is it the jurisprudential maxim, which is like common for all rulings whatsoever, and jurisprudential principle is specific to one ruling, if I'm not mistaken. We did something like that.
So I'll share with you one. So one of the differences is that a jurisprudential maxim, for example, qa'ida fiqhiyya, is something that can be used by layman's, mukallaf, right? So for example, the application of a jurisprudential maxim is in the hands of a mukallaf, right? You don't need to be a mujtahid to apply. Once you learn a jurisprudential maxim, you don't need to be a mujtahid to apply it. The application of a jurisprudential maxim is in the hands of all people. But a jurisprudential principle, like the validity, Hujjiyat khabar al-thiqa, the validity of the narration of a reliable person, only a mujtahid can benefit from that principle. So that's one of the differences. We also mentioned that the ruling that we arrive at when we apply a jurisprudential maxim mirrors the content of the jurisprudential maxim itself, like qa'idat al-tahara, the maxim of purity. Everything is tahir until you know that it is najis. When you apply it, the ruling is either going to be this is tahir or this is najis, meaning it mirrors, it matches the content of the maxim itself. Whereas when you apply a jurisprudential principle, when you apply hujjiyat khabar al-thiqa, you discover that, that a narration that is transmitted by a reliable person is proof. when you apply it, you find that, for example, Fulan ibn Fulan, that Zurara, for example, is thiqa. You find his name in the chain of transmission, and you come to the conclusion that this narration is correct, and this narration indicates that wine, for example, is prohibited to consume. So the ruling that we arrive at when we apply a jurisprudential principle is different from the content of the jurisprudential principle itself. So these are just some of the, and just another thing to mention, that when you apply a jurisprudential principle, Hujjiyat Khabar al-Thiqa can be applied to every area of fiqh, whereas Qa'idat la tu'ad, as we'll cover today, the principle of not repeating, is more restricted, meaning that we can only apply it to Kitab al-Salah. So these are just some of the differences that we covered in our last session. So you guys didn't receive the PowerPoint notes. I sent them to Sayyid Baqir. I'm not sure. I just record the sessions and I send it to him. But I'll touch base with him and see why you guys didn't receive the notes. Did you guys receive at least the video? Okay, so you guys have the video. I sent him the notes. I'll let him know that I'm a very nice instructor, and I actually give I give my students the notes. Okay, so inshallah, today we're going to begin the first qa'ida, which is qa'idat la tu'ad. Now, in the English translation, the sequence of the maxims is a bit different. In the English translation, the first maxim that the translator covers is qa'idatul tahara, I believe, the maxim of purity. But in the Arabic version, the first qa'ida, the first jurisprudential maxim that is covered is qa'idat la tu'ad, the maxim of not repeating, which is related to salah, and this is the maxim that we'll be covering first. Okay, so let's get into it. Qa'idat la tu'ad, the maxim of not repeating. La tu'ad meaning you don't need to repeat. Now, this is one of the most useful maxims for us to be familiar with, and if you can even memorize it, it will be very useful, because it's a qa'ida, it's a jurisprudential maxim that is mawrid ibtila', that it is relevant because it relates to our daily prayers. And we perform our prayers 5 times a day. So it's something that it's a very practical maxim to be familiar with. And because we're human, because we're fallible, sometimes we make mistakes in our prayers. And when we make mistakes in our prayers, and after our prayers, when we realize that we made a mistake in our prayers, we forgot to perform a part of the prayer, we wonder, do I have to repeat my salah, or is my salah valid? So one of the most useful maxims for us to memorize is qa'idat la tu'ad, the maxim of not repeating. It is especially relevant because it relates to the daily prayers. There are some maxims that deal with, for example, transactions, and maybe you'll be exposed to that particular situation once or twice in your life. But because qa'idat la tu'ad is related to the daily prayers, it's something that's very useful, because chances are you're going to need this qa'ida. You're going to need to refer to it to determine whether your prayer is valid or invalid, whether you need to repeat it or not. So it's especially relevant because it relates to the daily prayers and can help us determine whether or not a mistake made in our prayers requires us to repeat the prayer or not. Now, the first thing that we need to discuss is what you find in the Arabic version is madhmun al-qa'ida. Madhmun al-qa'ida is basically that what is this maxim all about? What is the content of this maxim? What does it say? So what is the meaning of قاعدة لا تعاد. قاعدة لا تعاد is a maxim which states that if a person leaves out a part of the prayer or fails to observe some of its conditions, then it is not obligatory to repeat the prayer except if one of the following is breached. Number one, al-tahur, purity. And inshallah, we'll speak about what do we mean by tahara here, by tahur. Are we talking about tahara min al-hadath or tahara min al-khabath? Are we speaking about ritual impurity or are we speaking about physical impurity? That's a discussion that we'll, that we'll examine. So al-tahur. Number two, al-waqt. So for example, with respect to the first, if you perform your prayer and then after your salah, you realize that you didn't perform wudu, that you weren't in a state of tahara, you have to repeat the prayer because you breached tahur. So you pray, after you finish your salah, you think that, oh my God, I didn't do wudu. I wasn't in a state of tahara. You have to repeat it because there was a breach in one of these five, and one of them is al-tahur. The second, al-waqt. You pray Salatul Fajr, for example. It's dark, the sun hasn't risen yet, and you assume that it's the time of Fajr. You pray, and then later on you realize that you prayed too early. You prayed 15 minutes too early, before Al-Fajr al-Sadiq. You realize after you finish the prayer that you prayed Fajr too early. You have to repeat it because there was a breach in al-waqt. The time hasn't set in, so you have to repeat the prayer. Qibla, the direction of the prayer. So for example, you perform your prayer, and again, we'll get into these details. After you finish your prayer, you prayed in a direction where you thought it was the Qibla, and you realized that the Qibla was in the opposite direction. And the time of prayer hasn't passed yet. You prayed Salatul Dhuhr and Salatul Asr in one direction, in the direction that you thought was the Qibla, and then after the prayer you realized that it was in the opposite direction. You have to repeat, assuming that the time still hasn't become qada. Ruku', you miss ruku'. You realize after the prayer that I was so excited because I got to marry the girl that I wanted to, and you were so excited that you skipped ruku' and you went down into sujood. And you realize this after the prayer. There was a breach in ruku', or there was a breach in sujood. You didn't perform sujood. And we'll speak about, there are some detailed discussions. You missed both of the sajdas. And you realize that after the prayer. You have to repeat the prayer. So, if the deficiency in the prayer is one of these five, the prayer is batil. Even if the mistake is done unintentionally or out of ignorance. Now you may say, Sheikh, I prayed Salatul Dhuhr and I thought I was on wudu, but I wasn't, and I just forgot. You still have to repeat it. So even if the breach in those five, if it's a mistake or it's intentional or it's out of ignorance, it's not an excuse. If there is a deficiency in the prayer related to those five, tahur, qibla, waqt, ruku', sujood, the prayer is automatically null and void and it has to be repeated. If any other part of the prayer is breached, then the prayer is valid and does not need to be repeated. So for example, after the salah, you realize that I didn't recite a surah after Surah Al-Fatiha. You finish Salatul Dhuhr and you say, I didn't recite another surah. Or I forgot to even recite Surah Al-Fatiha. You don't need to repeat the prayer. Why? Because there was no breach in the five conditions that we mentioned. So any other prayer that is breached after then the prayer is valid and does not need to be repeated. So in other words, if the breach, if the void is related to one of the 5 pillars of the prayer, then the prayer is void. And if not, then the prayer remains valid and there's no need for the person to repeat the prayer. So this is مضمون القاعدة. This is basically the gist of the maxim. Now, the second thing that is discussed by the author is what is called madrakul qa'ida. And this is an important word for you to be familiar with. Madrak. Madrakul qa'ida means, what is the basis for this maxim? Where did we get this jurisprudential maxim from? Did fuqaha just make it up? What is the madrak? What is the source? What is the basis for this qa'ida? The basis for this qa'ida, and in fact many of the qawa'id, they're either ahadith or verses of the Quran. The majority of them are related to scriptural references. There's textual evidence for these maxims. So madrakul qa'ida, the basis for this maxim is an authentic tradition reported by Zurara. Zurara ibn A'yan was one of the premier students of Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq. Zurara was one of the top students of the 5th and 6th Imam. He was a faqih, he was a jurist, he was a theologian. And many, if it wasn't for Zurara and Muhammad ibn Muslim and these noble companions of the Imams, believe me, we would have the ulum, the teachings, the fiqh of Ahlul Bayt would have been lost. Imagine how blessed these individuals are, how much reward they continue to receive. You know, whenever we read a hadith from Zurara and we practice it, Zurara, this is like sadaqah jariyah for Zurara, that he continues to receive thawab because he is like the link between us and the Imams, that because of his efforts, because of how much time he spent with the Imams and how much effort he put in recording the ahadith, you know, he has a great position with Allah. And we're fortunate that the Imams were surrounded by people like Zurara to preserve this sacred knowledge. So this qa'ida is based on a sahihat Zurara, meaning it's a tradition that is authentic. And when we say sahih in the Shia tradition, we mean that the chain of transmission, the sanad, contains all of the individuals in the chain of transmission are, number one, they're ithna ashari, meaning they have the right aqidah, they have the correct belief system, they are all 12er Shias, and they are udul. They're known for being righteous, for being pious, for being just. So all of them are individuals of stellar reputation. They have the right aqidah, they're just, they're righteous. And Zurara narrates from Imam al-Baqir. So وَالْمَدْرَكُ لِلْقَاعِدَةِ الْمَذْكُورَةِ هُوَ صَحِيحَةُ زُرَارَةَ عَنْ أَبِي جَعْفَرَ. Abi Ja'far is the kunya of Imam al-Baqir. So Imam al-Sadiq is Abu Abdullah, that's his kunya. Imam al-Baqir, his kunya is Abu Ja'far, which has been transmitted. So this authentic narration from Zurara, from Imam al-Baqir, has been transmitted by a Sheikh al-Saduq. Sheikh al-Saduq should be a household name in any Shia household. Sheikh al-Saduq, Sheikh al-Muhaddithin, the master of the science of hadith, the master of hadith scholars. In his books, he's written many books, but two of them that mention this hadith is Al-Khisal, right? It's a hadith book. And Al-Faqih, here Al-Faqih means من لا يحضره الفقيه. So it's mentioned in one of al-kutub al-arba'a. And it's also mentioned by Sheikh al-Tusi in his book At-Tahdhib. So this narration is mentioned in 3 books at the very least, and 2 of those books are one of the 4 most reliable hadith collections in the Shia tradition. من لا يحضره الفقيه by Sheikh al-Saduq and At-Tahdhib by Sheikh al-Tusi. Now here's the narration mentioned by Sheikh al-Saduq. This is his sanad, his chain of transmission. حدثنا أبي رضي الله عنه. My father transmitted, he said, so Sheikh al-Saduq is relaying this hadith from his father. قال حدثنا سعد بن عبد الله. So Sheikh al-Saduq's father, Ibn Babawayh, he says that Sa'ad ibn Abdullah informed us. From Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Isa, عن الحسين ibn Sa'id, عن حماد ibn Isa, عن حريز, عن زرارة. So very solid chain of transmission. عن أبي جعفر قال لا تعاد الصلاة إلا من 5: الطهور والوقت والقبلة والركوع والسجود. ثم قال عليه السلام القراءة سنة والتشهد سنة والتكبير سنة ولا تنقض السنة الفريضة. In Al-Khisal, so that chain was mentioned in Al-Khisal, and I believe the same chain is also mentioned in Al-Faqih. Sheikh al-Saduq narrates from his father, from Sa'ad, from Ahmad ibn Muhammad, from Al-Husayn ibn Sa'id, from Hamad ibn Isa, from Hariz, from Zurara, from Abi Ja'far al-Baqir, who said prayer is not repeated except in 5 cases: purity, tahur, time, al-waqt, qibla, bowing, and prostration. He then said, Imam al-Baqir then said, reciting is a sunnah. Tashahhud is a sunnah. Takbir is a sunnah. And a sunnah does not invalidate a fariḍah. Now, as mentioned, this tradition has been transmitted by Sheikh al-Saduq in his books, Al-Khisal and Al-Faqih, and by Sheikh al-Tusi in his book, At-Tahdhib. Now, the sanad, the chain of transmission used by Sheikh al-Saduq in both traditions, meaning in Al-Khisal and in Man La Yahduru al-Faqih, are authentic and reliable. And the reason why we say it's authentic and reliable is because when you look at the chain of transmission, so if I go back to it, Sheikh al-Saduq's father is very well known, very prominent. Sheikh al-Saduq, all ulama of Rijal, they agree that he's beyond the need to be authenticated. His reliability is unquestionable. From Sa'ad, who is Sa'ad? If you go to the books of Rijal, وَأَمَّا Sa'ad, so Al-Najashi, who is one of the experts of knowing the biographies of narrators of the formative period, he says Sa'ad, this Sa'ad, who Sheikh al-Saduq's father narrates from, is Sheikh هذه الطائفة وفقيهها ووجهها. That this man, Sa'ad ibn Abdullah, is, Sheikh al-Najasi says, he is Sheikh هذه الطائفة, that he is one of the prominent scholars of the Ithna Ashari madhab. وَفَقِيهُهَا, he is a jurist of the highest caliber. وَوَجْهُهَا, and he is a prominent personality. And then you have Ahmad ibn Muhammad. Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Isa, Sheikh al-Tusi in his Fihrist. Again, Sheikh al-Tusi was also an expert on Rijal. He has, this an encyclopedia on the biographies of these individuals. He says, Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Isa, Sheikh Qum. Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Isa was in Qum. He was one of the scholars of Qum. وَوَجِيهَا, he was prominent. وَفَقِيهَهَا غَيْر مُدَافِعٍ, that he is an unquestionable, undisputed jurist in Qum. And then you have عن الحسين ibn Sa'id. Husayn ibn Sa'id, Sheikh al-Tusi, he says صاحب المصنفات الأهوازي ثقة, that he is reliable, and he also has published, he's written books. عن حماد ibn Isa. Hamad ibn Isa, فهو غريق الجحفة, he actually drowned. He died of drowning. Hamad ibn Isa. Najashi says about him, كان ثقة في حديثه صدوقا, that he was reliable in his hadith and he was very trustworthy, very honest. And Hamad ibn Isa is one of Ashabul Ijma'. There are a number of companions of the Imams who there is a consensus among the ulama that they are reliable. One of them is Hamad ibn Isa. Hariz. وَأَمَّا Hariz, Sheikh al-Tusi, he says, Hariz is thiqa. He's Kufi. So Hariz was from Kufa and he was reliable. على حد تعبير الشيخ. Sheikh al-Tusi, again, these are people who were familiar with the biographies of these individuals. He says Hariz was very reliable. وَأَمَّا زُرَارَ, as for Zurara, فَهُوَ شَيْخُ أَصْحَابِنَا فِي زَمَانِهِ, that he was one of the prominent scholars at his time. Zurara, وَمُتَقَدِّمُهُمْ عَلَى حَدِّ تَعْبِيرَ النَّجَاشِ, that Zurara is not just reliable, Zurara is one of the most illustrious scholars of his time. Again, no one doubts the reliability of Zurara. So you see that this sanad is very strong, that it's a very strong sanad mentioned by Sheikh al-Saduq in Al-Khisal and even in Man La Yahdhuruhu al-Faqih. Now, we mentioned that this hadith is mentioned in 3 places. So Sheikh al-Saduq's chains of transmission are authentic and reliable. Some scholars have an issue with the sanad of Sheikh al-Tusi in At-Tahdhib. So the chain of transmission mentioned by Sheikh al-Tusi in At-Tahdhib is questionable. But it is not an issue because we only need one authentic tradition, and Sheikh al-Saduq has provided 2 traditions with strong chains of transmission. So even if someone determines that the sanad mentioned by Sheikh al-Tusi in At-Tahdhib is weak, it doesn't affect the status of the hadith because we already have 2 chains of transmission that are reliable. Now, what is the problem with Sheikh al-Tusi's chain of transmission? The problem with it is that in the chain of transmission, there's Ibn Abi Umayr. So it's in the footnotes, it says, لأن الطريق الذي ذكره الشيخ إلى زرارة, Sheikh al-Tusi's chain that leads to Zurara passes through Ibn Abi Umayr عن بعض أصحابه. Now, Ibn Abi Umayr, if he transmits a hadith and he doesn't mention who he heard it from, because he was such a reliable person and he was so close to the Imams, he doesn't report narrations from anyone other than the Ma'soom. But if he says that I heard it from someone else, it becomes what? Mursal, because we don't know who this someone else is. يمر بابن أبي عمير عن بعض أصحابه قال أخبرنا. So there's a gap between Ibn Abi Umair and the Ma'soom and the Imam. And the Sheikh Al-Tusi also mentions that Sheikh Al-Tusi has a chain of transmission that links him to Zurara. Zurara is the last person in the chain. And Sheikh Al-Tusi's chain of transmission goes back to a book that was written by Zurara on the topic of predestination, on al-istita'a wal-jabr, on religious accountability and predestination. And it's unlikely that this hadith, which is related to fiqh, would be found in a theological book like al-istita'a wal-jabr by Zurara. So again, these are some of the discussions related to the Senate. Now, after the Imam mentions the Qa'ida itself, if you remember, the Imam then said what? Reciting is a sunnah. Al-qira'atu sunnah. Tashahhud is a sunnah. Takbir is a sunnah. And a sunnah does not invalidate a fariḍah. Meaning, if there is a breach, if there's a mistake made in the part of the salah that is sunnah, it doesn't invalidate the prayer itself. Now, the word sunnah is a term that usually refers, sometimes in fiqh, sunnah, if you read, for example, Shara'i al-Islam by Muhaqqiq al-Hilli, sunnah sometimes refers to something that's mustahab, that this is sunnah. But in this context, sunnah is a term that refers to what the Prophet had introduced, which is the opposite of fard, which commonly refers to what God has legislated. So we have two types of wajibat. We have something that's wajib that was legislated by the Prophet, and we have something that was legislated by God. Now they're both wajib, but some things were legislated by the Prophet and other things were legislated by God himself. So based on this, the meaning of bowing among the 5 parts of prayer are obligatory acts that God has decreed. So ruku', sujood, tahara, qibla, these are things that Allah has legislated as pillars of the prayer, as conditions of the prayer. Whereas the rest of the parts of the prayer are obligatory acts that the Prophet has legislated. So reciting Surah Al-Fatiha, the Prophet legislated that. Tashahhud, taslim, these are things that are wajib, but they are legislated by the Prophet. And therefore you find that any breach or void that occurs in what God has decreed renders the prayer invalid. Contrary to a breach or a void that occurs in what the Prophet ﷺ has legislated, as it will not invalidate the prayer, nor will it affect the validity of what God has decreed. So it seems that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because of how great the Prophet is and because of how much Allah loves the Prophet, that Allah has given the Prophet the authority to legislate, that whatever he decrees is part of the religion. So legislation sometimes happens through God, through Allah, and sometimes it happens through the words of the messenger. And in the end, everything that the Prophet legislates is what Allah wishes, what is pleasing to God. Because what the Prophet desires is always 100% compatible with what Allah desires. And whatever the Prophet dislikes is 100% consistent with what Allah dislikes. So in his book, Al-Kafi, and I've said this many times, and I'll repeat it because it's important. It's very sad that there are many Shias who are not familiar with Sheikh al-Kulayni. That Sheikh al-Kulayni, Sheikh al-Saduq, Sheikh al-Tusi, these names should be familiar to us. You know, in the same way that your average Sunni, if I pick any Sunni from the street and I ask him, who is Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari? They all know who Bukhari is. They know him because he's an important figure in their history, that their fiqh comes from him. Their understanding of religion comes from this man. Whereas if you take your average Shi'i and you ask him, who is Muhammad ibn Ya'qub al-Kulayni? Many of them, they don't know. We have to appreciate our scholarly heritage. That if it wasn't for these individuals, believe me, we would be completely lost. You know, whenever we read Al-Kafi, we should recite Surah Al-Fatiha for Sheikh al-Kulayni. When we read Man la yahduruhu al-faqih, we should recite Surah Al-Fatiha for Sheikh al-Saduq. We should remember these ulama, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us that in our history we've had noble scholars who were so meticulous and who cared so much and who endured poverty and persecution to preserve the ulum of Ahlul Bayt. So in Al-Kafi, which is the most reliable out of Al-Kutub al-Arba'a, Sheikh al-Kulayni has a chapter referring to the legislative authority of the Prophet under the title, the chapter of entrusting affairs of religion to the Messenger of God and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. So there's a section in Al-Kafi called Bab means section or chapter, Babu Tafwid ila Rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa ila al-a'immati alayhim as-salam fi amr ad-din. So not only is the Prophet the teacher of religion, the Prophet and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, they have the authority, they have a God-given authority to legislate. Whatever they say is part of the religion. So their responsibility is not to just explain. It's not just bayan. They have their mufawwad. They are entrusted by God. They have been given the authority to legislate. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in some ways, He doesn't micromanage them. There are some general principles that Allah has legislated, and the details, Allah leaves it up to the Prophet. And whatever the Prophet dictates, whatever he decrees, whatever he ordains, becomes a part of the deen, becomes a part of Islam. So the reciting Surah Al-Fatiha and another surah in the first and second rak'ah, this was legislated by the Prophet. And therefore, if any mistake happens in what the Prophet has legislated, it doesn't invalidate the prayer. But if there is a mistake made in those things that Allah has directly legislated, then yes, the prayer becomes invalid and it has to be repeated. So there is a distinction made between what Allah has decreed, what He has legislated, and what the Prophet has legislated. They're both wajib, but if there is a breach in what God Can you guys still hear me? Okay. So let me just reopen the PowerPoint. I got a message that I got kicked off for some reason. I don't know, did I say something controversial? Let's just pull this up real quick. So any breach or void that occurs in what God has decreed renders the prayer invalid, contrary to a breach or void that occurs in what the Prophet has legislated, as it will not invalidate the prayer, nor will it affect the validity of what God has decreed. So I'll stop there for today, and inshallah we'll continue our discussion next week, and I'll open up the floor for Q&A. Any questions or comments? Questions, comments? Yeah, alhamdulillah, I'm glad to hear that you guys found this to be pretty straightforward. Inshallah, next week it's going to get a bit more complicated. We're going to speak about, whether or not does this maxim apply to people who forgot or people who are ignorant of, some of the rulings of the prayer, and whether someone was ignorant because they just didn't know, or they were lazy and they just didn't bother to research. So there are two types of ignorance: someone who's culpable or inculpable. Jahil al-Qasr wal-Muqassir, and we'll go into more of those details, but alhamdulillah, I'm happy to hear that. Any other questions or comments?
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikhna.
Alaykum assalam wa rahmatullah.
So just a general question based on these maxims. Now, scholars such as yourself and other scholars that we see nowadays on the pulpit for lectures and whatnot, do you all still generally discuss some of these maxims amongst you, such as outstanding maxims out there? Or are these pretty much set in stone? Anybody who has been through the Hujjah are well aware of these without any doubts or controversial points from that standpoint?
So, one thing that I have to mention just parenthetically is that not everybody who lectures, who recites majalis is a scholar. Unfortunately, we live in a time where, people don't really look into credentials of speakers. But as we mentioned in our first session, the number of jurisprudential maxims are not set in stone. So some scholars might debate that, these two jurisprudential maxims are one in essence. So sometimes there's a disagreement about the number of maxims. Some scholars conflate two jurisprudential maxims into one. Others see them as being being separate. There are. As we'll come to see, there's a discussion among scholars as to, what's the implication of the maxim. So, for example, you have some scholars that say qa'idat la tu'ad, which is the one that we're studying. It applies to someone someone who is nasi, someone who forgot. So, for example, I recited Salatul Dhuhr, and after Salatul Dhuhr, I realized that I didn't recite Surah Al-Fatiha. I forgot, or I didn't recite the second surah. I forgot. There is a general agreement among scholars that qa'idat la tu'ad applies to someone who forgot. But how about someone who just didn't know that they were supposed to recite a second surah after Surah Al-Fatiha? Does it also apply to someone who is ignorant of this ruling? And if you say it applies to someone who's ignorant, does it apply to someone whose ignorance is innocent in the sense that they tried to learn, but they just missed that one message, or they were, they're converts? Or does it also apply to someone who is careless and didn't bother to even learn what are the obligatory parts of the prayer? So there's a debate among scholars whether this qaida applies to someone whose jahl is from qusur or taqsir. So yeah, I mean, as you'll see, and this is discussed at length in Dars Kharij, like, when it comes to qa'idat, la darar, the maxim of no harm, what does that mean? Does it mean that are we talking about harm on the individual or harm on others? So yeah, it's not set in stone. These are maxims that are debated, and the indication of the maxims are debated. The scope, the applicability of the maxims are also discussed by ulama. But in this course, we'll touch upon that, and you'll see that, you might read a jurisprudential maxim and you think that, oh, that's pretty straightforward, and then you realize that, oh yeah, I didn't think about it from this perspective, and then you see, the giants of our tradition debated. Sayyid al-Khou'i has this view and he disagrees with his teacher. So you see that there's a lot of analysis that goes behind these jurisprudential maxims, and I think that oftentimes we don't appreciate the amount of work and the scholarly analysis that goes behind understanding these maxims.
So is it fair to say that our scholars, such as when they reach the position of marja'iyya, that there could be variances in these jurisprudential maxims from one marja' to another marja' based on this research that has taken place?
Absolutely. No, again, some jurisprudential maxims are pretty straightforward,
right?
But others, like qa'idat al-darar, as well, the maxim of no harm. Scholars have written essays on this topic. They've written entire books where they kind of debate the different views. So qa'idat al-darar, in fact, some scholars write on this topic just to prove their ijtihad, because there are so many different discussions on qa'idat al-darar.
So, Sheikhna, as far as what this course is covering, are you covering these various maxims that are essentially agreed upon amongst all mainstream scholars?
So no, as you'll see, even in every section, I'm going to share with you guys some of the debates that happen between the scholars, the points of disagreement, and even the author, who was a student of Sayyid al-Khou'i, he'll even say that this is Sayyid al-Khou'i's opinion, but I think that the maxim means this. So, I'll give you guys a taste of some of the disagreements and the points of contention among scholars. Otherwise the course, it becomes too dull. It's kind of good to kind of be exposed to some of these scholarly debates. We won't go into too much depth, but just to give you a taste, a little appetizer of these scholarly debates.
I mean, based on what you covered from the last class, Sheikhna, and this class, as well as what we covered in our jurisprudential class in our first year, I could say that once you go through such a class and think about the various aspects of these maxims, that it opens up your thought process to how fiqh works altogether. Sometimes when you see these speakers that come out there to just give speeches or lectures, I'm thinking that if they haven't been through this type of analysis, it's hard for them to even pass judgments, or, well, I shouldn't say judgments, that's a strong word, opinions in society from that standpoint, based on fiqhi laws altogether, or what their foresight will be on society. Is that a fair statement?
I believe so, yeah. I mean, one of the great benefits of Hawza is that you become a lot more cautious, before you issue an opinion, because you know that this issue has so many different dimensions. So yeah, when you go through the Hawza, you become, much more cautious, right? Because you see, like, if someone asks a question, someone who doesn't have a strong background in their seminary studies, to them it's black and white. But someone who's been through the rigor of seminary studies, they can see all of the gray areas as soon as the question is answered. So if you look at it from because they see all of the different scenarios, and they try to understand what would be the ruling if this happened. Okay, if this happened, what would be the ruling? So yeah, it's definitely important. That's why when you read the Risala Amaliyah of your marja, that's why they give you so many different scenarios. If this happens, then this is the ruling. But if this happens, then this is the ruling. If this condition is not observed, then this is the ruling. Why do they think like that? Because they've been trained for years, many, many years, to dissect and to look at any issue, any jurisprudential issue from all different angles. And they even create theoretical situations, and they try to figure out what would be the ruling under this theoretical situation. And you see this in the books of our fiqh.
I mean, one thing that I've noticed nowadays, for example, there are some distinct, unique speakers out there who even critique this line of thought altogether. Perhaps it speaks volumes that they haven't been through this kind of a intensive thinking as far as their thought process is concerned, and perhaps they critique various rulings. So based on what you have just covered, I mean, that clearly distinguishes a person who has been through this type of training before they even critique such a process.
You know, it's funny that you mentioned this. I've heard speakers ridicule the fatwa or the opinion of scholars who say that it's haram to shake hands with the opposite gender. And they say, oh, you know what, if we shake hands, we're going to end up sleeping together. This shows how ignorant they are, that they have no understanding of the basics of fiqh. Even when it comes to the issue of tahara and najasa, whether or not a kafir is considered najis or tahir. And they think, they get emotional and they say, oh, how could you label a human being as, because they haven't even looked at the ahadith. For them, it's so easy to just dismiss, the views of scholars because they haven't looked at the ahadith and the evidence. So, as I said, there's a reason why Sayyid al-Sistani has so much ihtiyat in his rulings. Some people get frustrated that, oh, there's so much ihtiyat wujubi, ihtiyat istihbabi. It's because he's God-fearing. It's because he has to stand before God and answer. Like, he can't give a fatwa if he's not 100% sure. And when you look at the ahadith and the views, and you see, sometimes you have contradictory narrations, you have to exercise that degree of caution, because at the end of the day, you're going to be answerable to God. Why did you give this religious ruling in God's name when you weren't 100% sure?
No, thank you, Sheikh. No, this was a really good discussion. Thanks again.
Ahsantum, barakallah bikum. Any other questions or comments? I have to, sign off in a few minutes, but any final questions or comments?
Sheikh, now, would you be mentioning, when you mention the maxims, would you be mentioning which marjas are in favor of or accept this as a maxim and which don't?
I don't think I'll have the time to do that, but because again, I would have to actually go, because we don't have a book that would say, this marja believes in this qaida. You'll have to go through their legal manual and just kind of, you'd have to basically deduce from their rulings which, what their opinions are. So it's hard to really tell unless you attend their dars kharij to see what their views are. So,
but is it necessary for us to know which, if our marja is in favor of a particular maxim? Or
I mean, it's not whether they're not. I mean, these maxims they exist. It's just about what the scholar understands from this maxim. Now, the point of this course is not for us to exercise our ijtihad. You refer to the risala amaliyah of your marja, but when it comes to I'll make it very clear when how you and I as mukallafin can apply these maxims without overstepping our limits and engaging in ijtihad when we don't have the qualifications. So I'll make that very clear, inshallah. I'll make that distinction.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no more questions or comments, inshallah, I'll leave you with I'll leave you to enjoy the rest of your weekend. Please make dua for us if you can. Try to attend majalis of Imam al-Hassan and Sayyid Ruqayya in these nights. And inshallah, we'll continue our discussion on Qa'idat La Tu'ad next week. Inshallah, I am hoping that next week we'll be able to finish our discussion on the maxim of not repeating, and then inshallah, we'll move on to the next one. وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين. All right, guys, take care. مع السلامة.